Everybody sitting comfortably?
Yeah. Everybody's here on time.
Yeah, amazing. Well, welcome. A very significant national event. This is Salman's first public event since Iceland. He won the Laxness Award, which is really a big deal.
What Ian isn't telling you is that he won it before me.
Yeah, when it meant something. Yeah. We thought we'd try, but we're probably not going to succeed. To just not have an interview. Bear in mind, Vladimir Nabokov, in a Cornell lecture, rather harshly talked of themes in literature as so much moonshine. And if we could dodge the moonshine and just talk a little more generally, looking back over a lifetime of writing, and maybe trying to keep something going between us rather than an interrogation, which so many literary interviews turn out to be. But there is one thing we just want to get out of the way first, because I know it'll be on your mind. In Salman's wonderful account of the vicious assault on him in August 22, he starts with an epigraph from Samuel Beckett. "We are other, no longer what we were before the calamity of yesterday." And to bookend that on the very last page, extremely moving, touching evocation of his love for Eliza, but a sense too that there is, in that pleasure there is pain. And he speaks a rather wonderful antithetical phrase, wounded happiness. So, Salman, we need to know, how are you, first of all? Wounded, happy?
Well, yeah, those things. I mean, I'm okay, you know. I mean, surprisingly. There are things that are not okay. Like, obviously, this right eye is not okay. My left hand is not great. But other than that, I'm what they call a medical miracle. That's the technical term.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I had several of the doctors whose job it was to inspect various bits of me were very impressed.
Yeah. But what about also at the psychological?
The psychological, well, that's, you know, that's an ongoing project.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm all right, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I've now acquired that very un-British thing, which is a therapist.
Becoming an American.
But, you know, I live in New York, so it's a compulsory. and he's been very helpful, actually. Because, you know, a good therapist will help you see yourself in a way that is refreshing, I mean, it's new. You know, it's not the way in which you ordinarily see yourself.
Yeah.
So it's helpful. That's been great. So, I mean, I think the thing about trauma is that it goes away slowly.
Yeah.
You know.
But it goes away.
But it goes away. I mean, I stopped having the damn nightmares. I used to have these nightmares. They stopped.
All right.
Well, now, my dreams always, I was always very pleased about my dreams. Because my dreams used to be very, very boring. I would dream like I read the newspaper. And I always thought it's because I'm using up all this dream material in the work, you know. And so when I'm actually dreaming, there's no dream material left. So my dream is I went for a walk.
So we could adapt the Chinese curse, may you have interesting dreams.
Yeah, so I'm getting back to boring dreams, which is very comforting.
Well, if you can bear it, Salman,
Yeah.
could you just take us through the moment when I imagine you were in a tent not unlike this?
Yeah, bigger. I mean, it was an amphitheater.
Well, it's
You know,
America, of course.
like, which seated 5,000 people.
Yeah.
I mean, there weren't 5,000 people. There were about 1,500 people.
Right.
And a big circular amphitheater with the open on the sides.
Yeah.
And a stage, slightly bigger stage than this, but stage. And we'd just come on stage, my interlocutor, Henry Rees, and me. And actually, we were there to talk about him, because Henry lives in Pittsburgh, and he started refuge system for writers who needed safe places. He started off with one little house, and then now he has a street in Pittsburgh called Sampsonia Way, where he has a bunch of houses where he gives safe spaces to writers from around the world.
Yep.
And this was his 20th anniversary of doing it. So the point was to go there to celebrate what he'd done.
This was not about you.
No, it was about him.
But you were a founder.
Well, I would know. What happened is I'd made a speech in Pittsburgh 20-odd years earlier, at which I talked about the growth of a similar organization across Europe.
Yeah.
This thing which is now called ICOR, which is the International City of Refuge Network. And I was sort of involved in the beginning of setting that up. So I was talking about how we'd had this network of cities which all helped look after writers who needed it. And some of it's very kind of amazing, that the first American city that became a city of refuge, amazingly, was Las Vegas. And the first writer who went to Las Vegas to live for a few years was from Sierra Leone. And I thought, I want to read that book.
Yeah, yes.
What happens when a poet from Sierra Leone goes to Vegas?
Yeah. So you saw a figure get to his feet, come towards you.
Yeah, he came. I mean, as I say, it was a much bigger audience, but he was sort of there. And I saw him stand up and come towards the stage, and then he started running. And he had like a COVID mask on. So he had like a black COVID mask on, face mask, so I could only see this part of his face. But it all happened incredibly quickly.
Did you see a knife in his hand?
Never saw the weapon. Never saw it. I mean, I saw he was running at me, and I guessed that he was not coming to ask for my autograph, you know. So I stood up. I mean, I had just sat down. We had just begun the conversation. Yeah. And I stood up and turned towards him. And then, you know, he hit me. I thought he punched me here. But I didn't realize there was a knife in his fist.
But you put up a hand, as I remember.
Yeah, I did that. And then, yeah, so he stuck a knife in that too. So Fran Lebowitz said to me, "Salman, you're right-handed, right?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Why do you hold up your left hand?" And I said, "Well, Fran, I kind of wasn't thinking about it." And I said, "Well, maybe it's like a boxer. You know, if you're a right-handed boxer, you defend with your left hand and you punch with your right hand. So maybe that was it." And she said, "Well, two things, Salman. First of all, you're not a boxer."
She noticed.
And secondly, you weren't punching anybody. You were the punchee. And yeah, so anyway, I put up my left hand and he stuck a knife in it. And then all over the place. And then this amazing thing happened, which is that the audience rescued me. First, Henry, who was sitting a bit further away than you are now, he came running. And Henry's not a young man. You know, Henry's in his 70s, like you.
Like you.
And anyway, so Henry came running over and kind of rugby tackled him. This is a guy who's 27 years old with a knife. And Henry tackled him. And then the whole front row of the audience rushed up.
Right.
And I mean, I'm lying on the ground, not feeling great. But I was aware of the fact that there was this sort of heap of bodies to my right somewhere.
Some of them medics.
Yes, there were doctors. There were two doctors, I think. And then they were very helpful as well.
It's one of those events. I mean, it was so planetary, the news, and I think an awful lot of people can remember where they were and what they were doing when this story broke.
I remember.
What were you doing? Yes, you were lying on the ground as usual. But if we were sitting here 3 years ago and I were to ask you about the fatwa, would your answer have been, well, basically that's all over?
It did feel over. Yeah. You know, it did feel over because it had been, I mean, God knows how long. I mean, you know, 1989 is a long time ago.
Yeah.
And the world moves on. You know, we live in a time when the subject changes very fast. Yeah. And yesterday's hot topic is today nobody talks about it. You know, so, and I thought that's what had happened. I thought the world had just moved on.
Yeah.
And actually, I'd been I'd done hundreds of events
Yeah.
in the intervening time, and there had never been a whisper of trouble. So I thought, okay, so that was yesterday, this is today. And that's why what I said in the book, that when he came at me, it felt anachronistic. It felt like out of time, you know. I mean, what are you doing here now? You were expected 30 years ago.
I want to come back to that, but when we were talking about this a few months ago in my house, you gave me a detail that your alleged assailant, I should say.
Oh, yes. Yes, he is alleged.
Alleged. On his way after his arrest, he'd forgotten something.
Yeah, there are some bits of this that are simultaneously funny and not funny. So that, for example, the last thing he did before he left Fairview, New Jersey, to get a bus to Chautauqua, New York, the last thing he did was to make a phone call, cancel his gym membership.
Quite wise.
Because, you know, why should he go on paying the standing order?
Yeah.
So that, you know, is weird, funny, not funny. And then after he was arrested at the scene by the police officer who showed up, and he was being taken away, he said to the arresting officer that he'd forgotten something in the auditorium, which was his backpack.
Yeah.
And the officer said, "Is there a bomb in the backpack?" And he said, "No, there are knives in it." And they went and found it. It's full of knives.
They went back.
They went back and it was sitting there in the auditorium with knives in it. I thought, what is that even about? Was he planning to make a last-minute selection?
Well, Your Honour, I'm a very keen cook. I can imagine.
Yeah, or was he going to pass them out?
Yeah.
But I mean, it was just, there are bits of this that I don't understand. That's one of them.
So, if there's now more of a continuum, as it were, between 89 and 2022, maybe that's the point. Given your long experience, you're president of US Penn, you've spoken for the rights and freedoms of expression of many writers around the world. Give us your take on the temperature of freedom of expression globally now. Where do you think it is?
I mean, it's not great, is it?
No.
I think it's a difficult moment for free speech because, first of all, there's what always used to happen, which is authoritarian forces trying to limit it or remove it, and that's authoritarian of various levels. I mean, of course, there's like China, which is dictatorship, or Florida, which is another kind of authoritarian system, where suddenly children are being told what books have to be banned from school libraries, or from lending libraries. And these books include some of the greatest books ever written, like Beloved.
This is
Kill a Mockingbird.
self-inflicted harm in an open society.
Yeah, and then what multiplies that is now there's a kind of, if you like, a kind of force coming from the left as well. You know, there's a kind of bien-pensant willingness to entertain the suppression of certain voices because you find them to be unpleasant, you know, and for virtuous reasons. You know, and I mean, one of the things I learned way back was that it's kind of no trick to support the free expression of people you agree with.
Yes.
Or indeed of people you're indifferent to. You know, you don't care what they think. But it's when somebody says something you really don't like, you discover if you believe in free speech or not. You know?
We've sort of lost in the West the art of disagreement, it seems.
Yeah. And I mean, I remember, back in the bad old days, like in 89, thereabouts, there was this movie that was made about me in Pakistan, I think. And it was called International Guerrillas. And the International Guerrillas were basically terrorists, and the bad guy was me. So they were the heroes, and they were supposed to kill me. And actually, at the end of the film, the character playing me was in fact killed, but not by any of them. He was killed by a flying Quran unleashing thunderbolts.
Oh, as they do.
And I thought, personally attacked by the Almighty. I thought there's dignity in that, you know. Anyway, the point is this terrible film. And in England, it was refused a certificate because it was, you know, in many ways defamatory and so on. And then I thought, here I am fighting a free speech battle and I'm being defended by an act of censorship.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in the end, I wrote a letter to the British Board of Film Classification, giving up my right of, because I could have sued them, so giving up my legal rights, saying if you're not giving it a certificate because of me, then I withdraw my attack, if you like. You know. Yeah. So they did give it a certificate, and it opened in like Bradford, you know, and nobody went to see it. Because why? Lousy movie.
Yeah.
You know? Nobody wanted to spend their 10 quid on a lousy movie. And it taught me a lesson about trusting the audience.
Yeah.
You know, people can make up their own minds, and people know when it's shit. You know.
But a lot of it seemed like tens of millions of enemies when Satanic Verses was over. They hadn't read it.
They hadn't read it, no. And that used to piss me off. And then I thought, let's look at the history of the persecution of books. You know, the people who accused James Joyce of being a pornographer had obviously not read Ulysses, because Joyce had many talents, but maybe arousing sexual heat was maybe, was maybe not one of them.
I don't know, the Circe scenes in the brothel are pretty amazing.
Well, you know, the people who accused Nabokov after Lolita of being a pedophile had obviously never read an incredibly moral book.
Yeah.
You know, so then I thought, okay, maybe it's a necessary precondition of attacking a book to not read it.
To not read it. Well, I think, you know, we've had recent street riots and a whole library went up in flames just outside Liverpool.
Yeah, so I heard about that.
And practically every writer in the land has written to offer to send books. In fact, most of us have not had a reply because they've been completely overwhelmed. So, you know, there's an upside to this too.
Yeah, and what is interesting actually in America now is that there's a fight back against this book banning thing.
Yeah.
I mean, what just happened, I think last week or maybe the week before, is that the big six publishers, you know, the Random House, Hachette, Simon & Schuster, all of those people, have collectively, with the support of PEN America, brought an action against the government of Florida, saying that these book bans are in breach of the First Amendment.
Constitution, yeah.
And so that case is going through, and I think there's really quite a seriously good chance that will win.
Right.
So there is a fight back, yes.
But there aren't many American writers in prison.
No.
So we're thinking Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, Russia, China. There's a big chunk of the world.
It's a lot, and that's, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, what things like the City of Refuge Network, I mean, obviously it's a pathetically small response to a big problem. But it was something we could do, you know, and I mean, I think there's now about 50 cities or something, you know, that take part in this.
Okay, well, look, with the Paris Olympics in mind still, I see us on the last lap, coming around that final bend into the home straight. And the finishing line is our 80th birthdays. Now, you're going to get there first, and I don't mind.
I'm planning my 100th birthday.
Yeah. Okay, well, you're going to have to go around a few times.
So I've decided it has to be a dance party.
Right, okay. You can lead the dance.
And we're trying to find a DJ, so any offers gratefully received.
So I want to look back.
Looking back.
So, best and worst of times. Often in a gathering like this, there are some young writers. And most of us look back to some wonderful moment in the struggle to become a writer, when you think it's within my grasp, or I've grasped it, or I have it.
Yeah, well, you got there before me, because, you know, your first book of stories was immediately well received, and that must have been a moment like that for you.
I had a sort of a minor moment that felt to me at the time bigger, which was my only ambition at the time in 1971 or two was to get into literary magazines. I didn't even think about book publishing. And there was a lovely publication called the New American Review. Ted Solitaroff ran it, a wonderful editor. And it came out as a paperback book 3 or 4 times a year.
I have some of them.
And well, if you look at the November issue for 1973, it landed on my doormat in my whitewashed cell in Norwich. And there was a bright pink paperback book, and on the cover, in equal writing, it said, Philip Roth, Susan Sontag, Gunter Grass, and Ian McEwan. Now, I was 24.
That'll do.
And I have never been able to repeat that high.
No.
It's been downhill all the way. So.
Yeah, no, for me,
so let's hear yours.
I don't have anything, I can't beat that. But I was working in advertising when Midnight Children came out, because that's how I wrote it.
Yeah.
In those days, you could get a part-time job. So I was working like 2-3 days a week in advertising and then writing the book the rest. Anyway, it came out, did well received, etc. So I thought, okay, time to leave the agency. So I went to see this guy, David, who was what they call the creative director, which is like a contradiction in terms. And I said, David, I quit. And he said, oh, you want a raise? And I said, no, David, I wrote this book, it came out, it's done well. I always wanted to be a writer. Now it seems I can be a writer. So I want to write another book, so I quit. And he said, oh, you want a big raise? and then I said, no, David, let me put it to you this way. I'm supposed to give you 1 month's notice. So this is just to tell you that in 31 days' time, I will not be coming into the office. And he said, oh, I don't think we can give you as much as that. And then, the day came when I did walk out of the office, and just that feeling of leaving the ad agency, knowing that I never had to go back, that felt like freedom.
How long were you at the agency?
Well, on and off. But, as I say, it wasn't a full-time job. It was a part-time job. And I would always try and do it at the end of the week. I'd try and do Thursday, Friday.
Yeah.
And I would come home, and I would have a really long bath. I would wash capitalism off me. And then I would have 3 or 4 days to be an artist. The other way around was much easier.
Yeah.
Didn't have to have a bath.
I never had a job. It's very interesting to hear what it's like. I've spent quite a lot of time, and I know you have too, talking to young writers in their 20s, even in their teens. In fact, I picked up a book last week, and I saw that the writer was born this century. So just get that sort of perspective.
Yeah, that's happened.
It's quite spooky, that. Have we been, us boomers, a very lucky generation?
I mean, I don't know. I think we've been as lucky as any generation. But I think maybe we're the... I don't want to say that there are fewer readers than there used to be. But maybe there are.
I ask because when I was 23 or 4, 25, say, living in London by this time, I had a rather spacious flat, a bit of a raggedy area in Stockwell.
Yeah.
But it was £12 a month. So if I wrote a review for The Observer for £40, that was the rent covered for a bit, and you could get by. Yeah, no,
this is real old geezer stuff.
It is old geezer stuff. So I just want the old geezers to stop being attacked by knives.
Yeah, I mean, when I first came to live in London after leaving Cambridge, 5 of us rented a house just off the New King's Road. 5 of us paying £5 a week each. £25, 5-bedroom house.
Yeah.
And you could go out, see a movie and have, as they say, a slap-up meal. and have change from a fiver.
Yeah.
So, you know, you could live on 10 or 15 pounds a week.
Now, we don't know the rates of inflation, whether a
no,
fiver is worth
you can add a zero. You can add a zero to that,
yeah.
maybe,
Yeah.
you know, but it's still not much. But I mean, I think the other question: do you get asked for writing advice?
I get asked to speak it.
Yeah. Well, my only bit of useful writing advice is to break the rule which says write what you know.
Yes, write what you don't know.
Write what you don't know. Find something out. You know?
Right.
Because what happens thank God I don't have to teach creative writing. But there are a few occasions when I have, all the texts are all the same. They're all about, you know, your dad doesn't understand you and your mother doesn't like you and
yeah.
You know, and there's an unpleasant dog next door.
First sex.
And I said, one of these students who had written one of these texts, I said, look, how would it be if you were living in that sort of suburban hell and a spaceship landed on the lawn?
Yeah.
You know, then what would happen?
Yeah. You'd have a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah. Or Earth Girls Are Easy, which is the other one, since we were talking about Gina Davis.
What if someone said to Kafka, write what you know?
Exactly. You'd have written about insurance.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've just been rereading what was actually his first written novel, or the last published, which is America. And he never came to America, never went there. And the America in his book is completely imaginary.
It's got that K in it, which is...
Yes, there's still the character called Carl. Yeah. And now the title, the K in the title was put in by his editor. Yeah. You know, but he only ever had a working title for it, which was The Stoker.
Yeah.
And in the final chapter, the final unfinished chapter of America, a chapter called The Nature Theater of Oklahoma, in which his character, Carl, auditions for this imaginary theater group that's going to perform in Oklahoma. And they get on a train. He gets a job, and he gets on this train with his friend, and they're going. And as they arrive at Oklahoma, he sees the mountains and deep gorges of Oklahoma, which doesn't have anything like that. Right. Well, it's quite flat.
He's writing what he doesn't know.
Yeah, but he made up an America to inhabit, and the result of it is, you know, masterpiece. So I think write what you don't know. And one of the things, for example, to come closer to home, Dickens, one of the things that is really admirable, I think, in Dickens, is the breadth, the range of world that he can inhabit. Yeah. You know, he can be pickpockets and archbishops, you know, and everything in between, little shopkeepers in between. So the only way of doing that is to go find stuff out. Yeah. You know, and so write what you know is okay, but maybe increase what you know. You know, go and find out something and write about that.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you, because I know last time we spoke, I was just finishing a novel. You'd written Knife, but you hadn't started. And we talked about this strangely neglected topic, as Kingsley Amis might have put it, of the space between novels, what one does, and
when you're not writing,
the use of it, how it can be oppressive, it can be a delight. I just wanted to explore that a little while.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what happens with you. I mean, with me, sometimes it comes quickly and sometimes it doesn't. You know, I mean, sometimes you know more or less what's next, and sometimes it takes a while. Yeah. You know, and my view is it's actually a very interesting moment when you don't know what's next. Yeah. Because actually I do just as much work when I don't know what I'm writing as when I do know what I'm writing. I sit there every day and sort of kick stuff around and see what's in my head and try and work out why it's in my head and write little passages, which can be a description of a place, or it can be a moment in a scene, or it can be anything. And the next day I think, well, that's garbage, you know, and throw it away or put it aside. These days, you don't throw things away, you put this aside and then you sell them to your archive holders.
Yes. that long queue.
I remember our mutual long ago publisher, Tom Mashler, once said to me when I just first had been signed up at Cape, he said, do you keep the stuff that you're throwing away? I said, no, I put it in the bin. He said, don't put it in the bin. He said, put a cardboard box next to your desk and throw it in the cardboard box, and one day it'll pay off your mortgage. And that's what it did.
It did, yeah. You know, there was a very unfair review of Ford Maddox Ford by V.S. Pritchett.
Mm.
And Pritchett was railing against Ford's inability to ever refuse a party invitation, and basically calling him a flibberty gibbet, and saying that his novels suffer, and I think he was so wrong about this, but he said he lacked the capacity for, and this was the phrase, determined stupor.
Oh.
A sort of willed stupor in which you don't do much, but slowly things come through to you as through a cloud.
Yeah, I don't know about that cloud.
Passivity that actually turns out not to be passivity at all. No. Things just slowly float to the surface.
I think what is true, I don't like that idea of the cloud.
You know? You don't like that idea? Okay.
But what I do think...
I'm not trying to sell it to you, by the way.
No, well, I'm not buying.
Okay. Oh, well, then I'm not selling.
But what I do think is, I don't know about, how carefully do you plan before you start?
It varies every time. I've got no prescription on it. Sometimes.
Because when I was starting out, I used to have to plan very carefully.
Did you?
I used to have like architecture, you know, and what happens when and to whom and all that. And until I had that architecture, I couldn't start putting anything on it, you know.
Yeah.
So, and now it ain't like that.
You know, in the Morgan Library, there is a novel of Henry James, which actually wasn't the novel, it was his notes for a novel, but it's typed. And he describes every paragraph.
Every paragraph, yeah.
It's a sort of meta-novel. And he sent it to the publisher. It was turned down reasonably enough. I mean, because it was just... It was like the Golden Bowl, even more convoluted.
Wow.
Because it was just a description of the paragraph.
Yeah. Fitzgerald was a bit like that. He used to work out things. But what I found now is, of course, you know, obviously you have to have an idea for a book, you know, and you have to know it's going from here and it's probably going to end up somewhere like here, and these things may happen during the course of it to these people. You have that sort of a loose.
Yeah.
But I'm much more willing to see what happens now.
Yeah.
You know.
It's a journey.
Yeah, I now think of it more and more as a, you know, as a voyage of discovery.
Yeah.
You find out what the book you're writing is by writing it.
Yeah. You're paddling up the Orinoco, as it were.
As it were. Not that I've ever done that.
No, don't do that.
Don't do it. No, you probably did that.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
You're a well-traveled
jet. Up and down
jet.
it, night and day.
But I think, you know, I think, and the way I found myself thinking about it is that, you know, it's a difference between composing a symphony and playing jazz. You know, the one thing has to be completely worked out, down to the last note. And the other thing is, I mean, when Miles stands up to blow, I don't think he entirely knows what's coming out of his trumpet until it comes out of it.
Well, in his early days, he'd have a chord sequence, and that slowly vanished.
Yeah, but I mean, I think now I'm playing jazz. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you said sometimes. Well, everyone remembers Trollope, you know, drawing a line under the novel he just finished with the Warden or whatever, and then not wasting paper, starting the next one
on the same piece of paper.
Yes, on the same bit of paper.
Well, there's a story about Trollope, which you could tell me if it's true or not, but that he finished a novel and he wouldn't get up from the desk until he'd written the first sentence of the next novel.
Yeah. That's a bit like Hemingway's advice, you know, don't leave off one night until you've written the first sentence of the next day's work, so it's sort of waiting for you. But coming back to this long stretch of time, we talked about this, well, we emailed about this, of what shaped us, what we think at this point looking back. And I think one would give a different answer when one was 30 or 50. Yeah. And I think what you're beginning to write now rather encapsulates the major, powerful things in the literary life that have determined what you are.
Well, you know, I think of it as cities, you know. There are these 3 cities that have meant a lot to me, you know, which is the city that I still call Bombay.
Not Mumbai.
No, I can give you my $2 on that if you want.
Well,
And then London and New York. So those 3. And really almost everything I've written, not all of it, I mean, Victory City, for example, is an exception to that rule. But an enormous amount of what I've written comes out of those places. And not just those places, but very specific neighborhoods in those places. You know, and it's like I don't have what Faulkner had, which is Yoknapatawpha, you know, I mean, Oxford, Mississippi. I did have the pleasure of being shown around Oxford, Mississippi by a Faulkner scholar who would say, you know, that's the picket fence where the idiot boy used to stand. Yeah. That's the lawyer's office that was an Intruder in the Dust, etc. You walk around this quite small town and all the novels are there, you know.
Yeah.
I don't have that. But in these particular cities, I have particular places which are powerful for me. You know, so that, yeah.
So looming for you, you're actually going to address these 3 cities. I mean, do you want, like, talking, some people hate it, some people love it, talking about what you're just about to do. Martin Amis used to love telling you precisely what he was going to do that day.
Yeah, and then he wouldn't do it. But I mean, I don't know. I remember reading an interview with Gabriel Garcia Marquez when he was writing, or just beginning to write, The Autumn of the Patriarch.
Yeah.
And the journalist said, "What are you working on?" And he said, which is true, he said he was writing his dictator novel. He said all Latin American writers in the end have to write their dictator novel.
Oh.
And many of them did. You know, there's a lot of there's Alejo Carpentier and there's Augusto Roa Bastos and there's so many Latin American writers who have a dictator novel. Anyway, he said, "I'm writing my dictator novel," and the journalist said, "Well, can you say something about it?" And he said, "Yes, for a long time I didn't know how it would go." He said, "But now I've realized that it has to be the testimony of the dictator as he gives evidence to a people's court." Which I thought, okay, that's an interesting idea, but it's not at all what The Autumn of the Patriarch is about. You know, so somewhere between that interview and finishing the book, it completely changed.
This reminds me, coming back to your notion of a journey, that it's quite often, I think, writers start something and you have to get something wrong in order to get something right.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it happens to you, but it happens to me quite often, and in fact, I kind of wait for it. That there's a point in the writing when I get stuck. And I thought, where do you go from here? I don't know where it goes from here. And I've learned that what that means is that there is something not properly, either wrongly imagined or under-imagined back there somewhere. You know, and it can be 1 page back or it can be 100 pages back. But you've got to go find that and fix it, and then you've actually got the book you can write.
I started Atonement as a science fiction novel set in the 25th century when elites just wanted to live the life of figures in a Jane Austen novel. They were tired of technology and electricity, so they had harpsichords and big country houses, and they had servants and horses. And it was the proletariat who, in my vision of it in the first chapter, had diodes in their heads that gave them instant access to vast amounts of information and so on. And I remembered, we mentioned this last time we spoke, that Samuel Johnson adage, nothing odd writes long. He was talking of Tristram Shandy.
Tristram Shandy will not last.
Yes. And I thought, this is odd and it's not going to last even short. And so I plucked out the diodes, sent it back 500 years and started all over again. But I could not have started the novel without
that.
Going what was left to me with the characters. I could move on with that. But it's hard to generalize about these processes, isn't it?
No, I don't know, because each of us, I think we all stumble in our own way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I envy people who have a milieu, you know, that the books always take place in a certain kind of world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't feel that I have that. So for me, place becomes the big question mark. Until I know where it's going to happen and when, I don't know what to do. That's the first decision I have to make.
It's interesting, your triptych of cities. It makes me think of a small book, but a wonderful book of yours, East-West.
Oh, short stories.
Of short stories. And I was thinking of that story, The Harmony of the Spheres. I couldn't believe that these characters weren't people you knew. But the fusion of two places batting off each other, I thought was exhilarating.
Well, I did in that story, and the bit that is true is that I did have a friend, college friend, who committed suicide.
Yeah.
And that was the sort of genesis of that story, but then it went off in all kinds of,
the sort of
ways.
Battiness of Eastern philosophies, so-called, in people's lives.
No, I had a friend of mine who shot himself with a shotgun, with the same gun with which his father had killed himself.
That's in the story.
Yeah, and I just thought it was very powerful as an image.
I don't know. It's not only, like all writers, we began as readers. And just briefly, because I can't believe this clock. I think they've speeded it up.
Are we done already?
Yeah. No, not, you can't get, you don't go yet.
Okay.
I want to talk about
reading.
What you were looking for.
Well, I tell you,
what do you want?
One of the things that really opened my mind was being in a bookshop in Cambridge. Doesn't exist anymore, but anyway, there I was. And on this sort of little table of new books, there was this very strange-looking paperback published by John Calder with this weird-looking, blind-looking guy on the cover. And it was called Fictions by Jorge Luis Borges.
Right.
I'd never heard of him. I'd never heard of the book. I picked it up because of how weird he looked.
Yeah.
And I opened the book, and it was just had this feeling of just falling into the book.
Yeah.
You know, and I started reading it, and eventually the bookshop owner came over and he said, "Are you going to buy that book?"
No.
Well,
I'm going to steal it.
I hadn't been planning to buy it.
I'll come
I was
back
planning to stand there and read the whole damn thing.
Yeah.
But I did buy it. And it's one of those books where every one of the texts in it tells you can do things that you didn't know you can do. You know, oh, you can do that. You know, you can do that. That works. It was mind-blowing.
Those kinds of writers who rearrange the furniture of your mind, as it were, the way Borges does, so that the Garden of the Forking Paths or the Library of Babel, they become part of your own sort of inner language.
Yeah, become part of the way you see the world.
Yeah.
I think that's what I think about the phenomenon of falling in love with a book. Which maybe, I don't know how many times in a lifetime that happens.
Yeah.
You know, maybe not that many times.
Does it belong only to youth?
No.
No.
I mean, I think, you know, there are still writers I haven't, I mean, I got into terrible trouble when I was a young person, and there were things on television called book programs.
Yeah.
I was on a book program with Antonia Fraser and John Gross, who was editing the TLS at the time, and Melvin Bragg. And because it was like a Christmas edition, at the end of it, we had to play this party game of owning up to great books that we'd never read.
Never read, no.
John Gross, of course, said that, because John Gross had read everything.
Yeah.
So he said the only thing he hadn't done was read the Bible all the way through. Which I thought was really showing off.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
And I confessed to never having read Middlemarch.
No, right, so you won.
And so the next day, the newspaper calls himself a serious writer who never read Middlemarch.
Yeah. In David Lodge's novel, has a very competitive academic who wants to win the game and says he hasn't read Hamlet. He has read Hamlet. Anyway, he gets sacked.
Yeah.
So, but he wins.
Yeah. No, I mean, actually, my favorite kind of terrible writer story is in Don DeLillo's White Noise. There's a wannabe academic star who comes to meet the main character. The main character is a scholar called Jack Gladney who's written a lot about Hitler, about Nazism, and has a department in the university called Hitler Studies. And the young Turk says, you know, I so admire what you've done with Hitler. He is now, in a very real sense, your Hitler.
Yes. you can have.
And then there's a kind of wonderful comic pause, and he says, "It's what I'd like to do with Elvis."
If only. We've entered that time for a few questions, and there's one right here in the second row.
Yeah.
Hi, great event. Thank you for being here, just seeing you face to face. I'm a writer too, and I have a question about the book Knife. Being in such a traumatic events and being so much heroic rise from the assassin, I imagine it must be very hard, not only to you, but also to the other half, but the partner. I could imagine a lot of those decision-making, sleepless night when you were in recovery or in unconsciousness. And among all those things, you have been accomplished a book, a big book. I'm just wondering, all these recoveries and book, she must done a lot to you. And that's not my question. I'm asking, what did you do to her? I mean, you are in New York, you couples therapy, you must be in couples therapy, but what did you initiated to do to help her to get through the trauma she experienced?
Well, she's sitting in front of you. But it's, well, we, I think, both helped each other a lot. I think, you know, we kind of nursed each other through this. And we also had outside help, both of us, separately. We didn't have couples therapy, we had individual therapy. And when it's not past tense either, it's present tense, have. And, you know, I think, put it like this, I think many people in this room will be aware of having had in their lives some moment of tragedy, trauma, horror, awful things happen to us all, you know, and we all have to deal with them as best we can, you know. And if we're lucky, we have allies in that process. We have people who love us and whom we love. And I certainly was lucky in that way. You know, I think that's as much as I can say at the moment.
Is it in this side?
Thank you for having come here. I feel almost guilty about asking about the fatwa and the attack because I think there's so much more to you as a writer. But if your younger self in, say, 1988 or 1989 knew that the sort of reaction to the book, do you think you would have pressed on, or do you think you would have just thought, well, it's not really worth the hassle?
Well, I mean, impossible to answer, but I'm very proud of the Satanic Verses. You know, I think it's as good a book as I'm able to write. And I actually can't imagine my literary shelf without it. You know, so, and as we were saying, the attack was based on ignorance. So in a way, it didn't matter what I wrote. People were going to take up cudgels. They did so without bothering to. I mean, in fact, the man who attacked me never read anything I'd written. By his own admission, read 2 pages. So, no, I mean, I think the answer is I don't know the answer, but I hope that I would have proceeded. And certainly in the time after the attack began, it was really very hard work to keep the book in print. You know, there were plenty of people who were scared, including publishers, and not just in England or not just, but around the world. And it was a battle to keep the book in print, a battle that took many years to win. But I thought there's no point fighting a free speech struggle if the thing in question disappears, because then you've lost. The book has been banned, suppressed. So we fought country by country to keep it in print. And there were some countries, for example, Norway, where publishers were very heroic and fearless. And actually, the Norwegian publisher was shot and almost killed, but continued to be very supportive. There were other countries where publishers were more scared. Where, I mean, I could tell you stories, but I won't. Yeah, but the fact is that we battled for the life of the book. Not just my life, but the life of the book. And we managed to win that battle anyway. So I'm proud of that.
We have a question over here.
You spoke earlier about writing what you know and writing what you don't know. In Knife, you talked about that you had to write the experience out as non-fiction before you felt you could move on. I was just reading Jeanette Winston's sort of autobiographical retelling of Orange is Not the Only Fruit, where she mythologizes her life. I was just wondering, are there events that you feel are so traumatic that they can't be fictionalized? And where do you feel you draw the boundary between myth and reality?
Yeah, good question. What I felt I don't have a theory about it, so I don't have a general rule. What I felt in this case was that the only thing that was interesting about it was that it really happened. That as fiction, it would be less interesting than as fact. And so I thought, in this particular case, fiction has to step to one side. And you have to tell as truthfully as you possibly can exactly your experience of what happened. And not only my experience, because one of the ways in which this book was written was to find out how other people were reacting. And what there were moments when I wasn't fully observing what was going on because of the state of my health, but other people were. So it's a question of gathering information and try and spin that into something which feels like the truth. In general, if I'm going to make a general statement, I prefer to make things up. I mean, the reason I became a writer was to make things up. And it never occurred to me that I would write 2 books about my own life. I thought my own life is a thing I don't want to write about. I want to write about other people's lives who are people I invent. And that's still my kind of default setting, And I think now I'm actually quite looking forward to getting back to that, getting back to making things up and telling invented stories. But in this case, as I say, I thought to make it up would be to diminish it in some way.
Let's have some questions from further back, down on the left-hand side in the corridor here.
How important was it, the imaginary conversation that you invented with the attacker?
Well, for me, for me as the author, it was the most interesting thing to write, to imagine myself into his head. There was a moment at the beginning when I floated the possibility of trying to get to see him. My wife, Eliza, was strongly opposed. You're not doing that, she said. And then, I mean, even if it was possible, it probably his lawyers wouldn't have permitted it anyway. But it was just a thing in my head. And then I thought, well, maybe I wouldn't learn very much, And the example that I put in the book of Beckett being stabbed. Beckett was stabbed when he was very young, hadn't written most of the great stuff. He was stabbed by a pimp in Montmartre, in Montparnasse, a pimp with the wonderful name of Proudhon. Proudhon the pimp stabbed him. And Beckett actually did go to the court and ask him, why do you do it? And he said, "C'est pas, monsieur, je m'excuse." I don't know, sir, I'm sorry. Well, that didn't get you very far, does it? that doesn't help. And I thought, well, if I was to actually see this guy, I would probably get some I don't think I would get an apology, but I'd get like cliches. And it wouldn't really teach me anything I can't already surmise. And so I thought, well, you're a person who lives by the imagination, so imagine him. And then, in a funny way, he becomes your character. And he belongs to you now. So I thought that's a way of replying. Possess him. So I thought, okay, I will possess you, asshole.
You made him a far more intelligent and interesting asshole than he probably is.
Well, I thought you've got to give him a
break.
You've got to give the devil the best lines.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, yeah. Well, Milton's technique.
Yeah.
How are we doing here? This gentleman here.
Thank you for the talk today. Given everything that's happened to you and all the experience, what motivates you now? Like, what keeps you going in the morning?
I can only do one thing. You know, so I may as well do it. Because otherwise I'm unemployed. And so I write books. When I was very young, I had a fantasy about being an actor, but I was brilliant, intelligent enough to not follow that fantasy, except occasionally in little vignettes here and there. I like it. I like writing books. And I hope there's a few more left, you know. I think one of the strange things that Ian was talking about, how old we are. I'm older than him. A little older than him. He's quite old.
And you're very old, yeah.
Okay. But, you know, it's a strange moment when what is ahead of you is shorter than what is behind you. But what it does is focus your mind. You think, don't waste your time. Get on with it. Use the time that you have. And to answer your question, what do I do when I get up in the morning? I try and use the time that I have. You know? And I mean, I hope, as I say, 100th birthday party, so I hope there's some years to go. But I mean, this is, I don't know how many you've done. This is 22 for me. There's not going to be another 22. But I hope there's a few, you know, and I'm working on it.
We've got time for one more question. I'll take one from the back there because we haven't had many from that portion.
It's two questions actually, which is a bit annoying. Which book of each other's do you most like and admire? And if you could have written one other book in the world, what would it? What would you wish that have been?
In the world ever?
Yes.
Okay.
A book that you had wished you had written yourself.
Well,
I know. You want to go first?
I'll go first. Actually, there are many books of Salman's that I love, if not them all. But I turned back knowing we were going to be talking, but I didn't think I knew we would not be talking about this book. Fairly early book, and I think it's absolutely magnificent, called Shame. And if you haven't read Shame, I really urge you to get hold of a copy. And its opening 50 pages contain, for me, Salman, the things I love most about your writing, which is whatever you're addressing, there is an underlying tone of affection for variety of humankind, which is part of a subset. There's a subset of a larger point, which is all good writing is sort of humorous. Mm-hmm. There's a core of humor in even the most tragic lines of Shakespeare. So it's that element that I
Well,
do get shame.
Yeah, in your bookstore now.
All good bookstores.
I mean, I always think that there is a book that makes you fall in love with a writer, and that's what you remember. And I think your first two collections of stories, I just read all those stories in between the sheets, and
First Love.
First Love, Last Rites, which is the first one. I just thought every single one of these stories, you're asking what would you wish to have written, I thought every one of these stories I would like to have written.
Yeah, well.
And
they're also in all good bookstores.
Yeah.
I've got to bring this to an end now. We could go on another 2 or 3 hours, but Salman, stay safe and live long and keep on writing well.
Yeah.